Hi, I'm Iya Gozum, and this is Rappler Talk. As you're watching, world leaders are gathering in Baku, Azerbaijan for COP29, the biggest climate summit of the year. COP29 had been criticized for being held in an authoritarian country with a fossil fuel legacy. A recent investigation showed that the summit's corporate partners are linked to Azerbaijan President Ilham Aliyev's family and inner circle. Joining us today is journalist Ilya Lozovsky of the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Thanks, Ilya, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Thank you. So tell us about the report. What are the COP29 partners linked to the Aliyev family, and how would you describe the magnitude of a graft?
Well, there are several official partners of COP, as you mentioned, and they are basically big Azerbaijani companies. And in a country like Azerbaijan, which has been a dictatorship since its independence from the Soviet Union, all big business is eventually some way going to connect to the family, and and it's hard sometimes to disentangle all the different connections behind the scenes. But we can see, for example, that one of the partners is Pasha Holding. It's a huge conglomerate with interests across a range of industries that's basically controlled by the president's two daughters, Arzu and Leyla Aliyeva. Then there's a food producing company called Azersun, which is itself not owned by the family, but the nephew of the founder of the company once was in an offshore company that was set up for the Aliyev daughters. So there's clearly something behind the scenes happening there. Then there's an airline, Silkway, that was linked to the president's daughters through a conglomerate. There's a textile conglomerate that used to be held by the sisters. There's SOCAR Green, which is part of SOCAR, the state oil company, that used to be led by President Aliyev before he was president. So basically, anywhere you look in these official partners, which are going to benefit from the COP, there is some kind of, it's not just some independent businessman who built a successful company themselves. There's always some kind of connection back to the president. And even not official partners can also benefit. For example, one of the hosts of the guests of the conference, they're going to come from all around the world to Azerbaijan. They need a place to stay. One of the places they're staying is this beautiful new resort that has been built on the Caspian Sea called Sea Breeze. And that's owned by Emin Agalarov. He's the former husband of one of the Aliyev daughters. And he began acquiring the land there to build that resort at the time that he was marrying one of the president's daughters. So he received a no-bid government contract, as investigative journalists have shown, to host the COP visitors. And he himself explained in an interview that he received a loan to further build more hotel rooms, more apartments. Right. From the government. So that's just another example of benefit. Everything in a country like Azerbaijan somehow is going to tie back to the regime. Right. And that's COP is no exception.
Right. And how do these links, do you think, affect the integrity of the most important climate summit in the world?
Well, the official partners have access basically to all of the international guests and distinguished politicians and business leaders and activists and everybody who comes to COP. So there are a range of benefits, one of which is greenwashing. This is this concept that basically by showing how much you're dedicated to fighting climate change and pollution and improving your environmental record, you can show what a great company you are, what a great country you are. Even though, you might be a subsidiary of a state oil company. Mm-hmm. So this allows not only these individual companies, but basically the entire country of Azerbaijan to show to the world how dedicated to fighting climate change they are, what a strong partner they are to other countries. President Aliyev has said, it's such a great honor for us as Azerbaijan to host. This shows the trust placed in us by the international community, but we should never forget that Azerbaijan is one of the most authoritarian countries in the world, with completely falsified elections, with journalists sitting in jail. Some of the same journalists who are reporting on these COP partners are now sitting in jail, just as the whole world comes together in Baku. So I would say that's worth pointing out, and it's pretty problematic.
Right, and I was actually going to ask about that. Azerbaijan has a history of jailing activists and journalists critical of Aliyev, who has been running the country since 2003, and it is now dealing with a racial discrimination case lodged at the International Court of Justice. how does being the host country of COP29, where, you know, leaders and activists and civil society come together, affect the image they want to project to the world?
Right. So I think this is actually complicated because there's no rule. COP is organized under the United Nations, and it's organized each year in a different region. And there's an official process for how countries are nominated within each region to become contenders to host the COPs. And there's no requirement that a country has to be a democracy or that a country has to be not corrupt or respect human rights or anything like that. So that's why, in the past, Egypt has held the COP. United Arab Emirates, those are also not democratic countries. Azerbaijan is probably the least democratic country ever, not to mention a major fossil fuel producer. It's complicated because you can't say, the United Nations is not a club of democracies. The United Nations is meant to be a forum where all countries in the world get together to discuss problems. And of course, climate change is something that affects every country, no matter whether it's democratic or not. And I suppose non-democratic countries have have a role to play also in fighting climate change. But there's a tension because now this greenwashing that I mentioned is really, these really flashy events are going to be happening in Baku. President Aliyev is going to be schmoozing with all world leaders. He's meeting with European leaders. I just saw a photo of him shaking hands the other day with Charles Michel. It's just gives the regime an opportunity to present itself as a part of the world order, a part of the international system, a friend. Aliyev has said Azerbaijan is going to help Europe and the rest of the world with gas and oil supplies because of the disruptions caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and sanctions against Russia. So it's kind of a dilemma because on the one hand, you can't, ignore a country just because you don't like the government or you think it's not democratic. But on the other hand, we have to point out that, people in Azerbaijan are in prison or in exile just for speaking the truth and trying to report the truth. And Aliyev has held on to power, as a dictator for many years. And now he is up on stage saying how much the world is trusting and respects Azerbaijan because they're hosting this summit. So
right.
It's
During
tricky.
the opening ceremony of the COP29 yesterday, on Monday, the main messaging is that what they keep saying is that Azerbaijan is the bridge between developing countries and developed nations, which is something that is a tension in the climate change discourse, right? What do you say of that image of a bridge, of that language, of how they project themselves as this intermediary between these two worlds, the global north and the global south?
Well, I'm not an expert on climate change diplomacy specifically. I would say that, yes, of course, we recognize this tension between the West or the developed world and some countries which say the West has profited, from fossil fuels for many years, and now they expect us all to stop using fossil fuels. This isn't fair. To the extent that Azerbaijan and the COP can address tensions and the climate negotiations, I would say I'm sure that's a good thing. But I think you also have to look at how I mentioned we talked about these corporate partners. One of the problems, as activist groups have pointed out, is that these fossil fuel companies actually see these COP summits as a way to make deals and actually strengthen connections with other fossil fuel producers. And ironically, a conference that's dedicated to fighting climate change ends up being a conference where a lot of new deals are made. And the BBC reported recently, I can't remember exactly the official who it was, but it was a SOCAR official from the state oil company, who was secretly filmed appearing to trade in his position as a SOCAR, as an organizer of the conference, to discuss making new fossil fuel deals. So, if Azerbaijan wants to be a bridge to reduce a certain tension in the climate movement, I would say there's another tension there that's appearing, and journalists are exposing, which is that, Azerbaijan is a huge producer of oil and gas, and this is going to be an opportunity to strengthen those links,
right?
And to enrich people.
Right. Reporting on corruption does not necessarily lead to stopping petrostates or authoritarian countries from becoming the COP host country. And we certainly do not want the COP to be postponed because of how urgent the climate crisis is becoming. Why is it relevant to pursue this critical press coverage still?
Yes, I think in the first place, I think of colleagues who don't have the freedom that I have to appear on your program and to speak about what's really happening in Azerbaijan because they are in prison, because they are not free to speak, even after if you're a critical journalist in Azerbaijan and you leave the country so you can speak freely, then they can still go after your family. The regime is not above doing those things. So I think that it's important for us as journalists to point out what kind of country this is that's hosting the COP. It's our responsibility to continue to point that out. And that's why our project is called Know Your Host. We're not activists. We're not saying the UN should have a COP here or here. We're not saying Azerbaijan should not host and this other country should host. That's not our role. Our role is to report what kind of country this is. Many people maybe who are interested in the climate movement or who are really passionate about climate change, they don't know maybe much about Azerbaijan. They come from other parts of the world. And so I think our role is to just show them the many tensions and contradictions that inevitably erupt when, again, I will stress the authoritarian part. The authoritarian country of Azerbaijan hosts such a prestigious summit. I mean, this is a country where you had once an election where the results that the ruling party had won were published before voting even started. So that was just a technical mistake that somebody made, but it shows that, the elections aren't fair. There's no real political opposition that's real. Civil society activists, in most countries in the world, civil society has a huge role to play in fighting climate change. They're the ones who are conveying people's concerns to the politicians. They're the ones who are making plans. They're the ones who are working with political leaders to find solutions. In Azerbaijan, there is no independent civil society. There is some kind of NGO council or group or something that I'm sure, these countries, there's always quasi-independent groups that look like civil society that are in fact super heavily tied to the government. We find that in Azerbaijan too. So I'm sure they will be playing that role. But people who come to the COP and people who are observing it should understand that this is not the same free and open civil society that we enjoy in many of our countries.
All right. Do you see any way how the United Nations or what the United Nations can do to prevent these conflicts of interest? And don't you think that more stringent measures in the selection of a host country can possibly turn off nations who have the resources to organize these high-level events?
Yes, so a group called the Anti-Corruption Data Collective has recently, their partnership with Transparency International, who we also work with, has published a report recently about this specific topic, and they have a lot of detailed recommendations that are probably too technical really to get into, but the main point is that there should be kind of requirements about transparency and commitment to human rights, commitment to avoiding conflict of interest when countries are under discussion for being chosen as COP hosts. And currently, basically, that's not the case. I think pretty much any country can host a COP. But, in Azerbaijan, officials don't have to publish their conflict of interest or declare anything. So that's why we are pointing out this official, this official, this official, if you read our report, has this connection, has this connection, has this connection, and now they're in the council. And we mentioned the partners earlier. So all these, but it's very hard actually in Azerbaijan to prove corruption. Our partners and our colleagues do very good work, but the corporate registry isn't open. There's no public declarations. So there's so little information out there that journalists can use. So that's why transparency requirements are so important. And other countries should, the United Nations probably should, find a way to take that into account when the hosts are selected.
Right. Basically, we're at an inflection point where we need to cut down emissions fast to mitigate the climate crisis, but also we want to balance that with, we do not want people who abuse power to be enabled under this crisis. Thanks, Ilya, for joining us.
Exactly.
If you're just tuning in, we've been talking with journalist Ilya Lozovsky on OCCRP's investigation into COP29 Partners' links to Azerbaijan president's family and inner circle. To follow Rappler's coverage of COP29, visit rappler.com/COP29 or check out the Environment and Science channel of the Rappler Communities app. Again, I'm Iya Gozum, and this has been Rappler Talk.